most recent, should I say, episode in the current Nigerian polity was the End Bad Governance protest, which for me, I'm not reading too much into it, but which is a bit of a continuation of the NSAS protest that we saw in 2020. We know how tragically that ended. And then the events of 3 years after, which was the elections last year, where a lot of young people were galvanized, angry, passionate to participate in the political process. And of course, were subsequently disappointed by the results, right? So how would you gauge how that has played out, from NSAS to where we are now? The youth are still not participating in politics. The youth's influence on the elections has not really been, I would say, influential in any sense. So, how things have played out till now and how they have not gone as expected, how would you analyze that?
Yes, to a large extent, I would agree that the young people and the youths, depending on how we define them, have not had quite the impact on certainly electoral politics the way they would like, and that's largely because political participation in Nigeria is way too heavily focused on elections. We have a political culture that goes dormant except for the last 12 months of a political cycle, when the political primaries start, for instance. So last time it started in 2022, we had primaries early in the year, and then we had the elections February of 2023. That's roughly 9 to 12 months is when political awareness grows for a number of people. The difficulty with that is, for one thing, there are far too many issues that exist for them to gain salience only during election season and to think that it will materialize in uptake within the political system. It's not going to happen. We need what some political scientists refer to as intermediaries, intermediary institutions that come between citizens and the Nigerians and the state, in this case, the Nigerian state, to negotiate, mediate, be a sort of middleman in terms of societal disputes, debates, controversies. A good example would be the fact that, as we talked about with NSAS, where the young people, primarily the young people in Nigeria, came together with a very simple message: end SARS, Special Anti-Robbery Squad. There were no real social institutions that the young people trusted. That was why the protests were decentralized in the way they were. That's why they were spontaneous in the way they were. That's why the organizers shunned political parties, political elites, established political figures, because they came to identify these people with everything they did not like. And there were no credible social institutions that could do that mediation that I'm referring to, whether they be churches, whether they be social clubs, whether they be professional groups, whether they be unions, any kind of collective corporate entity that can come between citizens and the state and be a negotiator, a broker of sorts. There were essentially none that the young people identified. So they created them. They created what they considered to be the types of intermediaries that they wanted. The political class did not see that coming. They did not understand it. They had no frame of reference for it. Because historically, contentious politics in Nigeria has taken place within the party system and the intermediaries that existed for the time, whether they be unions or things of that nature. So to see young Gen Zs, as we call them, gathering in Alausa, gathering in Agodi, gathering in Independence Square in Enugu, and all of these places, and forming their own bodies, forming legal aid organizations, forming medical aid associations, raising money for people, church groups, mosque groups. The political class had never seen that, where young people of that age, we are talking some of them 18, 19, 20, creating their own institutions. The political class had no frame of reference for that. So that's why they quickly pivoted, for instance, to let's negotiate. And we saw some of this, by the way, in Kenya with their own protests a couple of months ago. And the young Nigerians were saying, what are we negotiating about? We made very clear demands. End this goddamn thing called SARS and prosecute those who have been accused very credibly in many instances of killing people or brutalizing or whatever the case may be. So what are we negotiating? Yeah. Negotiate in the government's mind was, re-establishing dominance over the political order that they believe they had lost by virtue of not having, any communication channels with the young people, because they decided to articulate their own message and engage in their own activities on their own terms. Now, unfortunately, as you alluded to, the protest ended, tragically, where the protesters were shot at in Lekki and in other parts of Lagos and elsewhere across the country. The momentum stalled there, and during the 3 or so weeks of EndSARS, there was some kind of awakening toward wanting to do a different type of politics. Unfortunately, much of that was lost in terms of its institutional memory, and regrettably, some people defaulted to what they already knew. Oh, let's form youth parties and all of these other half-baked ideas. And then it became, oh, get your PVC. But the difficulty with that is elections are not just about what happens on election day. They're about what happens before and after election day. So yes, it's great to get your PVCs. It's great to do all of those things. It's great to get people registered, take interest in parties, but are you building the kinds of institutions that can regulate political competition outside of political parties? Because elections are quadrennial, they're once in 4 years. So those remaining, let's say, 3 years and 3 months outside that 9 to 12 month window I talked about, then what do you do? Are those issues going to wait? So unfortunately, folks reverted to what they knew. And thus, the election cycle of 2023 resembled what we knew before. Delayed election, rigging, INEC not following procedures, and then fundamentally, our elections have become a place where the result isn't determined on election day any longer. Sometimes it's determined a year after. Yeah. And that's a very bad place for a democracy to get to, because it has governance implications. If no governor can get the job done, if they are thinking they can be thrown out by the courts, that's a very bad place to be in. And I say this because literally 2 days ago in Thailand, the Prime Minister was thrown out by a court. That's a very bad place for a country serious about development to want to be in, where men and women in robes are being asked to provide legal answers to what are political questions that they do not have the range for. Because judges do not have the range for 99% of things thrown in front of them. But we are outsourcing the political competition that should take place within the contours of institutions to judges, to courts. That's not a sustainable arena, because what will happen is the courts will become partisan. They already have become partisan in Nigeria. What we have now is a situation where political parties and the strong individuals within them buy judgments, essentially, from parties. There will come a time someone somewhere will get up to hell with that ruling. Then what? That's how anarchy starts. This is how political orders are disrupted. These are the things that bring back the military. Where someone does that, and then in response, a colonel somewhere says, okay, now to hell with you. And then, this is how. So we have to think very deeply about the nature of political activity. It cannot be about elections alone, for the simple reason that elections, for one thing, do not resolve political disputes. And frankly, they are not intended to. Elections are about determining who gets to make decisions over finite resources within political institutions. They are not about resolving issues, because frankly, these issues are not to be resolved, because they are, human beings fundamentally disagree with each other. There are no solutions to many of the issues over which we disagree. There are only trade-offs. So if your entire framework is that elections should determine what happens, you will always be in for a disappointment. So that is where I think many of those who were enthusiastic about EndSARS probably went wrong in terms of how they thought about what would come next. But of course, it's a long-term struggle in the sense that Rome wasn't built in a day, and there's some continuity, as we pointed out, with EndSARS and the End Bad Governance protest of this month. I I think with the bad governance protests, you can certainly see the similarities in terms of the decentralization and all of these messages. I think the key difference there is that this current administration, the Tinubu administration, unlike the Buhari administration, cares much more about public perception, and thus very adroitly used a very useful mix of sticks and carrots. So there was a lot of cajoling of influencers, imams, pastors, don't protest, this and that, and even the president himself gave a televised address that frankly didn't contain any substance, but he wanted to be seen as being open to dialogue and be listening to the public in ways Buhari didn't care about. His ministers went on the airwaves to reaffirm, Mr. President cares about all of this, and we care about all of this. Governors, APC governors did the same thing. So Tinubu, being a much more effective politician in the way Buhari is not, was able to skillfully maneuver his way out of that difficulty. Now, of course, the issue won't go away because fundamentally Nigeria is in a very bad place that no amount of political skullduggery can get you out of. People are poorer, the country is less secure, people's futures are hanging in the balance. There is no easy fix out of that. But for the time being, the government was able to, to dampen those protests by, as I say, a sticks and carrot approach. There was repression and crackdowns, especially in the northern part of the country, and even here in Lagos too. But at the same time, there was a very useful and skillful way in which the APC and its acolytes brought out some of the opposition effectively. So I think these are the many issues that protesters, demonstrators, and citizens more broadly should think about political participation. It cannot be focused on elections alone because the same issues will keep coming up every time. Elections are not intended to resolve conclusively many of the issues we fight over. What they are meant to resolve is who gets to hold the reins of power.
So, I mean, you touched base with a lot that I'll try and unpack. But there was one thing you said, I forgot the platform now, which is a line that I now use very often, which is that political parties in Nigeria are just special purpose vehicles for winning elections. Yes. And that is like where I want us to focus on. Because, I mean, let's talk a bit about this end bad governance protest of a thing. We've gotten ourselves into a situation where even dissatisfaction with the current government that is popular is not an opportunity for an opposition party. Like, people are angry. Those are votes, even if we are talking about pure electoral competition, right? Those are potential votes that you can pick up if you speak up and advocate for these people, even if you're just doing it to further your own agenda or whatever. So I'll tell you one thing I find annoying and absurd about how this government went about everything they did, the PR, whatever. There's a mood, there's an attitude that always shows up in media briefing, in the way government and the acolytes address the people, which is they try to regulate dissent. Yes. They tell you what to ask for. They tell you how you should ask for it. You can protest. You have the constitutional right to protest, but you cannot say that a government should resign. Yes. Fuck it, you can say it. As long as you're not picking up weapons to invade the seat of power, it's speech, right? So, and then when you say that a particular governor or president or government should resign, then you're committing treason. Then you have agenda. Then you have, you can be hungry, but you can't ask the government that is making you hungry to go. Like, they try to, so because my attitude is always, so the fuck what if I say that the president should resign? It is speech. I said it. I don't have any power to force him to resign. So you cannot shoot me or prosecute me or arrest me or detain me simply by saying that. And I feel like in other times, even though, like you said, they are not bastions of advanced civilization, these are easily things that an opposition party will pick up on and capitalize on. You find in some situations, you find the opposition party leading the marches on the streets with the people in so many instances. You understand? Because so how have we gotten ourselves in this situation where no matter the name of the party, no matter the color of their flags, no matter the personnel that populated the party, everybody is just aligned, which is there is the political elites and there's the people. You know, and political competition is never really about the people. How have we gotten ourselves into this status quo? You know, I know people talk about, 1999 was a militarized democracy, right? But I mean, I still don't find that story particularly convincing. You know, that I know people like Patutomi and others have said that, the people that have dominated our politics in Nigeria were opportunists. You know that, some people fought for democracy from the military, and some political opportunists who have more resources and more connections invaded the space. But even the purists of this struggle, they are never truly advocates of the people. So how have we gotten ourselves to a situation where political parties are just, like you said, special purpose vehicles for winning elections, no more, no less?
There are a couple of reasons, some of which are internal to Nigeria's affairs and some of which are part of a broader structural state of affairs internationally. I'll start with the international element because it's easier. So Nigeria returned to civilian rule in 1999. So this is at the zenith of the good governance agenda. So the good governance agenda is the World Bank's framework for getting developing countries that turn to international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF for assistance, for financial assistance after their economy started to falter in the early 1980s. So the idea behind the good governance agenda was we've stabilized your economies by issuing structural adjustment programs, SAPs, as we know them in Nigeria and elsewhere. So now you need much broader reforms of your political system to consolidate those reforms. So you have to, and the 90s are important, particularly in Africa, because that's when the continent's democratization wave begins. So beginning in the 1980s, I'd say the mid to late 1980s, so you have the end of apartheid in Namibia and South Africa. You have countries like Benin, Zambia. You have Senegal in the 1980s moved to multi-party elections from single-party elections, and then you have other countries like Ghana due to transition from military rule under Jerry Rawlings to civilian rule. So many African countries go from single-party systems, military rule, or white minority rule to multi-party elections. In the context of the Cold War, because that's a big element of all of this. The Soviet Union dissolves, the US and its Western allies are proclaimed as the winners, basically, of that great conflict. The end of history, liberal capitalist democracy is on the ascendant. So there was no alternative, essentially speaking, in ideological terms. If you wanted to prosper as a country, you simply had to be like those liberal capitalist states. So African countries are essentially given that poison pill by the international community, right? International financial institutions, major donors, international civil society groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and all of the International Department for International Development in the UK, USAID, and the multitude of development partners essentially get African countries to move toward liberal capitalist democracy. What that does is it shrinks political competition. So in Nigeria, for instance, our political parties, contrary to what people believe, had ideological components.
Well, I was going to get to that, but especially.
Okay, so in the First Republic, the main parties were the Northern People's Congress. Now it was largely in what's northern Nigeria, the Action Group in what was Western Nigeria, and the National Council for Nigeria and Cameroon, the NCNC, largely but not exclusively in what was Eastern Nigeria. Of course, these were big tents to a large extent, but a large portion of what drove, let's say, the Action Group was a welfarist social democracy. There were much more cruder socialists, Trotskyites, and all of these other people. But fundamentally, the Action Group was a socialist, social welfarist party. Then the NPC was a conservative, traditionalist party with a statist bent, I would say. And then the NCNC was, broadly speaking, a liberal in the Western sense of the small L, Western sense of the word, pro-markets, pro-enterprise, pro-federalism party. And political organization, at least electoral organization, coalesced along those lines. For instance, Lagos is considered today to be part of the Southwest. NCNC, there was a time, was the dominant party in Lagos and not the Action Group. That's largely because the elites of Lagos identified with that kind of liberal idea that I described that the NCNC was. So people like Adeniran Musoya, for instance, was a member of the NCNC. Zik and Nnamdi Azikiwe was a member of the NCNC because they had similar ideas in terms of how they felt the economy should be run and what Nigeria should do with its federal system of government. Obviously, the Action Group, which was much more agrarian in the sense that its base was Yorubas, not exclusively, but Yorubas and people from what at some point was called the Midwest, people from rural communities, farmers, teachers, laborers, working class, if you will. And of course, the NPC was dominated by conservative, religiously, ideologically inclined people. There were dissenting elements among, the North, like let's say the Northern elements, Progressive Union, NAPU. But by and large, Northern political participation was concentrated in the NPC. And then in the Second Republic, obviously we had the coup of 1966, which brought an end to the First Republic. Then in the Second Republic, we had majorly 5 political parties, the dominant ones of which were the Nigerian Party, National Party of Nigeria, and the United Party for Nigeria, UPN and NPN. They were organized similarly along ideological lines, and they were offshoots of those old parties from the First Republic. But somewhere along the way, when the Second Republic came to an end, obviously the military came back to power. Then during the transition to a Third Republic, General Babangida creates 2 parties. Okay. That's a very crucial element in the story. Remember I said that the good governance agenda shrunk political parties, and that links to what I'm saying, that General Babangida talked about 2 parties, a little to the left, little to the right, as he said back then. So you had the Social Democratic Party and the National Republican Convention. Yeah. That normalized the idea that everyone should coalesce somewhere. So, option A4, for instance, in 1993, you lined up SDP or you lined up NRC. Mm-hmm. So that framework for electoral competition became normalized to the extent that people felt that you were either in one party or you were in the other. So even though, yes, there are technically today multiple parties, in reality, the sphere of competition takes place in only 2 parties. Now, there is some political science literature about electoral competition within first-past-the-post system. There's something called Duverger's law that talks about how in most electoral democracies, only two parties have a realistic chance of winning. That ties into some of all of this about how it was believed to be pragmatic, quote unquote, to coalesce within one of two parties if you really wanted a chance to win. But of course, as I alluded to reduce political competition to elections is deeply uninformed and dangerous, actually, for the host of reasons I alluded to. But that is where all of this, that's the international context under which, Nigeria and other African countries were sort of ushered to in terms of their democratic formation. Hey, all you needed to do was be, like Western countries, form a couple of political parties, two ideally, do some, pro-market reforms, hold elections, and everything should be fine. And that's the script we in Nigeria also took over. We didn't bother to fix the civil service, we didn't bother to fix the judiciary, we didn't bother to actually form parties that will actually, abide by their own rules and laws, none of that. As long as we form parties, as long as we hold elections, as long as we do pro-market reforms, everything should be okay. So that's the international context. The domestic context is that during the, and this relates to 1999, during the pro-democracy movement of the 1990s, a number of the participants, so people always talk about NADECO, for instance, the National Democratic Coalition.
Yeah, of which the current president was
precisely member. NADECO regrettably came to be synonymous with the opposition to General Abacha's regime. In reality, NADECO was one of several entities. Others included Campaign for Democracy. Others included CDE,
Concerned Professionals.
Precisely.
Yeah.
There were a range, Pengasa, NUPEC, these were unions back then. NADECO was just one element of the political opposition to General Abacha, much of which coalesced around Chief Moshood Abiola's campaign, because he was widely presumed to be the winner of that election. A number of these individuals were political elites, including Chief Abiola himself.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So their own terms of participation were not the same as everyone else's, but they had a common enemy, which was the armed forces, General Abacha specifically. So the opposition to General Abacha created bedfellows that otherwise would not have had much in common. Now, you can easily say, well, that's true of any political competition. Yes, that is correct, but fundamentally, the Nigerian party system was not prepared for meaningful competition in the way that it should have been, in the sense that when General Abacha died in 1998, first of all, he had started a transition that involved him himself, where we were to hold an election in 1998 and he was basically going to be the winner because he was the only candidate for 5 political parties. So he dies, General Abubakar, who succeeded him, restarts the transition and asks the 5 political parties to dissolve and they should reform themselves. There were no real terms of engagement, no real criteria given to the parties in terms of what ideology were they going to coalesce around, who was going to make up the parties. For instance, Bola Ige, the late Minister of Justice, wrote a lot of or at least inspired a lot of the what became the constitution of the political parties, of more than one of them. That tells you how these parties were very loosely defined. And it's quite interesting because Bola Ige said something about how Abacha's 5 political parties were 5 leprous fingers on the same hand, because as I say, Abacha got the nomination for all of the parties. And then a year later, or less than a year later, more or less the same thing happens. So the PDP forms from this loose coalition of, so there was something called the G34, a group of people who opposed General Abacha's self-succession, military officers and old political elites, many of them from the NPN in the Second Republic. They basically come together and form PDP. Then you have AD, the Alliance for Democracy. That's a lot of it is NADECO people, largely but not exclusively from the Southwest. Then you have APP, some of it from the individuals from the Southeast. Then you have, there are 2 other political parties, but the competition centers largely around the Alliance for Democracy and the PDP. These parties were much more similar than people let on at the time. And it was bound to be that way because, as I say, the terms of political competition were shrunk, while there were no real rules of engagement defined to allow the parties stand out. Essentially, the parties were created to have sameness. All that would be different is there'd be different names, different individuals. But the parties, there's very little difference substantively. So that is how you can have a scenario where when we have the transition back to civilian rule, General Obasanjo, President Obasanjo pursues what you can say is a neoliberal agenda, only for him to be succeeded by a person who's basically a Marxist, Yar'Adua. And then Yar'Adua is succeeded by Jonathan, who pursues what I would consider to be neoliberal ideas. And then he's succeeded by General Buhari, the first opposition candidate to win after 1999, whose party consists of many people from PDP. And then General Buhari's party pursues statist, welfarist policies. So you can see how there is no sense of continuity in the economic and political development post-1999 because the parties are made to look alike. People always say, and that's one of the reasons I sort of bristle when people say, oh, the Nigerian parties, they are all the same. And I think it's a little banal to say that because the reason they are the same is much more structural than just individuals. So people always make it seem as though the individuals are the reason, and in a very basic sense, yes, that is true. But you have to dig deeper into why the parties are the same, and that's because, as I say, powerful individuals took control of the parties early on in the process. Sameness is the name of the game. They are characterized by broadly similar ideas in terms of statist control over the economy to different degrees, which, by the way, doesn't. It's not antithetical to neoliberalism, and this is something I like to explain. Because when I say that, what do you mean? Neoliberalism is not the state and the markets are very much in tangent with one another. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism fundamentally is about rent seeking, rentiership. Neoliberalism is about the idea that every entity, organism in society is valuable to the extent that they produce rents for the political class. So when you think of it in that way, it becomes very clear to you that statism and pro-market economics are not quite in tension with one another as people seem to think. So Buhari's regime, Buhari's presidency pursues what I would consider to be statist policies, but underpinned by neoliberal ideas in terms of the policies he pursued. So
I think that is where I'm not going to pretend that we haven't talked about this before.
Yes.
I think that is where I would quibble with you quite a bit.
Yes, I know it's a very unpopular idea.
Okay, I mean, all cards on the table. I won't call myself neoliberal in that sense. Of course, as you know, I'm a bit of a more pro-market, Schopenhauerian capitalist.
Yes.
Now, so when you say Obasanjo, Jonathan, and these people pursue neoliberal, we know that broadly under the neoliberal umbrella bumper sticker policies like privatization, but also there is an element of openness to some form of free trade or freer trade, relatively. And I do not know a government in Nigeria that is not protectionist.
Yeah.
Obasanjo, for example, brought back a lot of state-owned enterprises despite some of the privatizations that he did. He basically brought back the old NNPC structure from the old NOC. There was the local content law. There was the electricity bill that one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of Nigeria was the 2005 electricity. There was the Land Use Act, which was a relic of the 1979 Constitution, which basically ceded all the private land in the country to the state. So, I'm going back to the ideology question. Can we really say that these people are different? Because there's a lot of shape-shifting. You see, a lot of all these pretend technocrats, even I don't want to mention names because you never know how they can get you with this cybercrime act these days. But you see a lot of people who come out now to pretend there was a very famous former Greek minister who we are still dealing with, who is now leading a multilateral institution and likes to talk. But we are still living with some of the relics of the terrible protectionist, ultimately destructive policies. There's the case of a former trade minister came from a very popular financial institution that more or less went on live TV to say that, his remit, his job description is basically to create more billionaires in Nigeria, right? And proceeded to, push an automobile policy that was extremely destructive, that proved very difficult to get rid of. So, ideologically, can we really call these people neoliberal, pro-market? They are pro-business, even this Dangote of a thing. I keep saying that the interest of Dangote is not necessarily the interest of Nigeria, but you find people heavily biased towards, let's protect Dangote is our baby, fine, but it might not really be in the interest of the country. So, the crucial difference between true pro-market capitalism, which is you guys compete to the death, may the best man win, to just taking state assets, state companies, and ceding them to a select group of private business men. And that's what we call capitalism here. So can we really call these people ideological in that sense, or they are just grifters and shapeshifters to me?
That's definitely the pushback I get when I make that assertion. And to that, my answer is usually that the idea that certain, picking of preferred winners, as it were, that the state should protect and help become national champions, as it were, that would help industrialization and all of these export growth, and then leave them to compete when the state determines they are capable of doing so, is a form of ideology in itself. I think when people tend to think of, first of all, when people hear the word ideology, they tend to imagine, especially people or things they don't agree with. But ideology fundamentally is a way of viewing the world. It's a way of thinking about the world, a way in which social relations are structured. And when you think about how, essentially, in Nigeria, what you have is the state transferring wealth to a very small, wealthy minority from the large majority of us. That's a form of ideology. That's an idea that certain designated individuals know best how to shape the economy in ways that will benefit all of us. And thus, we should be thankful to them for their stewardship of the national cake, as it were, for their ingenuity. And to buttress what you were saying, we hear so many people, including foreign commentators, talk about how wonderful it is that Dangote is the wealthiest man in Africa, how much his refinery will transform this and transform that. That's an ideology right there, because that is supposing that that's the only way to get this done. And fundamentally, that's what neoliberalism does, in that it presumes, as Margaret Thatcher quite literally used to say back in the 80s when she was prime minister, that there is no other way. Market-driven, and when I say market, it's in its most basic sense of economic exchange, that the only way to regulate or mediate economic exchanges between human beings is for the invisible hand, as it were, to partake, to regulate how they participate in the economy. The difficulty with that is that we're human beings. we have biases, we have preferences, and some of those biases include wanting to favor those with whom we have alliances and sympathies. So this idea that, just let everyone do what they do and may the best man win, is inconsistent with how history has worked anyway, because people have always displayed their biases and pretenses, certainly economically, where there is an advantage to be gained, and where the human mind is to think that it's a zero-sum game. In reality, I can benefit as can you, but the way society tends to be structured is such that people believe if I gain, someone loses. That's what creates the incentive for the invisible hand to become a very visible hand. So I say that to say that, statism is not necessarily antithetical to neoliberal economics, in the sense that, as I say, neoliberalism is about transferring wealth. It's about rent seeking, about making sure that every designated entity, every economic entity in society is assessed for its ability to generate income, rent for primarily political and economic elites. So any entity that cannot do that is useless. So the state, using its coercive powers, for instance, comes down and acts as a mediator in economic exchanges to ensure that the rules of the game favor the powerful and who are almost always backed by the state. So when you think of neoliberalism as a sociological phenomenon and not an economic one, everything about my position makes sense.
I want to pick up on something you touched on earlier, which is intermediaries between the state and the people and the citizen, so to speak. And I look at, of course, we know that political parties are one form of intermediaries, but there are other players, civil society organizations, pressure groups, trade unions, and even so many other business groups, social groups, and all that. And I want to look at how, they seem to be either ill-formed or maladaptive in Nigeria, and I really don't understand. Again, I'm seeking to understand as honestly as possible. That's the purpose of this conversation. How that came to be. One example that presents itself to my mind right now is the elections last year. Was a good example. And this happens every time. Where, again, driven by donors and foreign institutions, we pick one narrative as the outcome of desire. And then we end up failing badly. Like the whole of 2022 in the run-up to 2023, the conversation regarding the election was dominated by the new electoral law.
Yes.
And
that was going to change everything.
That was going to change the game. The beavers.
Yes.
Right? That was the killer technology. I recall there was one, and I mean that in itself made me very suspicious. A very, very popular former INEC rep was making the rounds in every television station of note in the country, explaining how beavers works, how it's impossible for electoral fraud and rigging to happen with beavers, and a lot of civil society organizations, election monitoring groups, this, that, lined up behind that same narrative. And look at what happened with the elections. Nobody thought of writing it in the law. What happens if the server shuts down or or whatever it is that when coupled with the elections? So we have this situation where institutions that are supposed to be intermediaries between the people and the state, are they themselves out of touch, ignorant, and sometimes even advocating or pursuing agenda that are completely irrelevant to the concerns of the people or even the country writ large. So how did we arrive at this status quo? Is it a question of incentive or like he who pays the piper dictates the tune? Because I know that a lot of our quote and unquote independent civil society organizations are foreign funded. I know that a lot of our domestic and prominent ones like MBA and are government funded. So is it a question of he who pays the piper dictates the tune, or how have we gotten even that so wrong?
To a large extent, much of that stems from power differentials between, and you just touched on for instance, the government funds a number of local interest groups and what have you. Many of these groups have, over the decades, been caught up in Nigeria's many socio-political struggles that they might as well be an extension of government, right? So that's one difficulty. Another is that the civil society in the big C and big S sense, large organized civil society, and some people like to term it, what you have with them is that a good number are also an extension of the political class. Many of them are funded by politicians. A large number, perhaps, I would say certainly, in terms of the prominent ones, actually all of them are funded by foreign donors, as you correctly noted. So they have every incentive, and this is not to suggest that there's some conspiracy going on, because sometimes when you give such an analysis, that's what some folks pick up on. Oh, are you saying there's some kind of conspiracy? No, but it is to say that no one gives you money out of the goodness of their heart. No one chooses to exercise some kind of indulgence, financial or otherwise, because they are nice. They have outcomes they are after. And part of that is that, and this is where what I was saying about the court inserting itself or being inserted, depending on how you look at it, into the electoral process is bad. We have tribunals after every election, after state assembly races, gubernatorial races, senate races, House of Reps, and the president. Most of the donors who contribute toward these, who fund these organized private civil society groups, favor the status quo. They are not interested in an overturned election. They will deny everything I just said when you ask them. I expect them to. I've worked for many of those organizations, so I know the game they play. I expect them to say, oh no, we have no stake in Nigeria's election. Nigerian people decide who their representatives are. At the same time, these people do mapping exercises. Years, some of it takes years. They do stakeholder analysis, political economy analysis, to know who the key players are, where. So they prepare essentially for individuals and factions and parties that take power. They've invested years, literally, as I've explained, in a particular outcome very often. Do you think that when it comes down to the wire, where the fate of, let's say for instance, President Tinubu at the tribunal, you think they're interested in having to do all that process again? You think they're interested in having to pay for another round of election? You don't think that, let's say, the UK and the US diplomatic missions have been, trying to build influence in Tinubu's circles? You think they are prepared to start that process again? So institutionally and structurally, they are invested in the status quo prevailing. For instance, Tinubu being declared the winner. Here's where that comes into play. Very often, civil society groups know that the elections have been poorly run, but they will not say so. For fear of being considered to be partisan or taking a side. Now, to me, a poorly run election is a poorly run election. Right? Why it's when you put the cards on the table, especially as you noted, we were told the Electoral Act would make elections stress-free. I remember the Osun election was seen as a dry run. The Osun gubernatorial and Ekiti in 2022 were seen as a dry run for 2023. And those were perceived to have gone well. So I remember all these same folks were like, see, we can do elections and we'll have the result out and everyone can move on. So when that didn't happen, so many people pulled their punches as to why that was. For the simple reason that they had interest to protect. So that suggests that even this idea of intermediaries can't be left to their devices. That suggests that civic participation is an all-encompassing effort. You have to watch the watchers, basically, because you cannot trust that, and you shouldn't actually trust that any person you have designated as some kind of societal umpire will exercise good judgment. What if they don't? And then, more to the point, you cannot expect that, as I say, many of these entities are funded by politicians themselves. Many civil society folk want to be politicians in the sense of running for office. So many of them are simply, biding their time within the civil society space. Many of them are, you also have to think of social class. Many of them are the prominent civil society groups in Nigeria are based in all of two places, Lagos, Abuja. So they are bound to think of issues from the prism of Lagos and Abuja. They have no clue what's happening in Benin Kebbi unless they are told, or they go there for 2 days or however long. So they inherently, there are biases. They have tunnel vision about so many issues, which is why I'm saying that you cannot outsource the responsibility of civil society to self-designated civil society folks. They have to be watched also. So when you start to think of the idea that there is this notion that, because you hear it very often, all we just need is some good people in government, some good people in this. There is no such thing as good people. There's no such thing as bad people either. People are good or bad to the extent that the rules of the game that they participate in allow them to be. So this notion of outsourcing your responsibilities to other people while you live your own life does not exist. Yeah. So that's why, based on our understanding of social relationships, these organizations and institutions will always come up short. Because people, for instance, believed that technology was going to fix all of the problems of Nigeria's elections, forgetting that human beings run technology. Technology is not a self-correcting mechanism.
I agree. So, but I mean, what role does agency, at least in the psychological and the philosophical sense, play here? Because, again, one of those great lines that you had, was it during or after the election, was when the Washington Post editorial came out. I recall, whether it was in one of your articles or was it on Twitter, where you talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations, right? Where, we've done elections. It was not perfect, but it wasn't so bad. But right now, stability is what matters, because God forbid we have a humanitarian crisis in a country as big as Nigeria. This stability at all costs bias, but at the same time, you see maybe some, however biased or weak, attempt to give an objective analysis, maybe like the EU report on the election that came out, always meets a very shrill, strong pushback from usually the main beneficiary of the electoral sham that just took place. So the way I look at our polity is that we always have agency when we want to engineer bad situations. Like all of a sudden we are a sovereign state and nobody can tell us what to do. But We can't even fund our own election monitoring. We need the EU to do this or that. I mean, the EU is funding INEC.
Yeah.
Like, how ridiculous. But at the same time, these people, they cannot interfere in our affairs, even at the sound of the slightest criticism. So, what is the role of agency here? Sovereign agency and the like. What is the role, especially in terms of creating genuine intermediary institutions?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Of course, you always see. I remember it was in 2019. That's it when then Governor Nasir El-Rufai talked about election observers who go home in body bags and something along those lines, and that no one can tell Nigeria how to run its elections and all of these things, but also fund INEC. So I would say that that's human nature. The human nature is inherently hypocritical because human nature tries to reconcile multiple positions and preferences that aren't always congruent, right? So everyone wants, yes, I'm sovereign, but no man is on an island. So Nigeria is no different in that regard. Neither are our politicians, who at the drop of a hat will tell you, Nigeria is a sovereign country. Nobody can tell us how to run our elections. But they are queuing up, demanding grants and aid and all of these things. Now, of course, much of this is simply structural international politics. But the point being that that's simply human nature. Much like how the great powers say to you, oh, democracy, this and the other thing, but back a guy like Sisi in Egypt. So human nature always features necessarily, I would argue, tensions that very often are irreconcilable. But to the broader question you ask about agency, when it comes to intermediaries, there's simply no alternative to taking ownership of the fact that no one is coming to save Nigeria. There's no, game saying that there is no way to overstate how important that is. The EU will not save Nigeria. The United States will not save Nigeria. The UK, China, name any foreign entity of your choice. They will not. So that has to be the first point made. And it seems banal to say that, but I also do know, for instance, that especially when it comes to the opposition politicians, when they get in trouble, then they start tagging the UK on Twitter. They start tagging the US, tagging Anthony Blinken, tagging now David Lammy, the foreign secretary, tagging this, that the UN.
And calling for sanctions.
Exactly. Oh, thanks for that point. Anytime anything happens in Nigeria, you will always have, let's say, the politician responsible for whatever. You have the opponent, sanction him, sanction that, forgetting that sanctions affect everybody. And when you say that, some more clever types say, oh no, I'm talking about targeted sanctions. And then you ask them, how do targeted sanctions work? They are not a real thing, actually, if you understand how sanctions work, because they target entities mainly that are based somewhere. So if a Nigerian leader is sanctioned, it will affect everything from trying to print the currency to passports and getting medication and all of these things, because that creates a kind of political risk. That's actually the danger of sanctions, by the way, not to segue too much. But people tend to think of sanctions as, oh, you can't use your foreign bank accounts. The real damage with sanctions is the uncertainty and risk it creates. For instance, companies don't want the US Treasury's problems. They don't want the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the US Treasury calling them up.
So whether you're political or not, they close your account.
Bang.
I mean, a lot of startups are experiencing that currently.
Literally, right?
With some of the foreign banks that they use. So you're right.
So that's the real fear. They do not want the Office of Foreign Assets Control showing up one day, or the FBI. Oh, then you go trading with a sanctioned entity. Well, penalized. No one wants that. That's the damage of sanctions. So when people throw out sanction this person, you might think you are doing opposition politics. well, you might be shooting yourself in the foot. So not to just to piggyback to where I was. There is no. We have to come to a place where we understand that the solution to Nigeria's problems are internal. They are in Nigeria. Now, of course, that can take on many forms, and they are, can look in many different ways. But this whole idea that when it's convenient, we'll run to the EU, to the UK, to the US, and then when it's not, we're a sovereign country. You can't have it both ways. You have to pick one, pick a side. If you want to be running to the EU, do that with your full chest, in every ramification that comes with it. And if you know you want your sovereignty, do that also with your full chest, in every part of its ramification. So I say that to say that things like the EU funding INEC, it's absurd. There is no reason. The last election, how much the Nigerian National Assembly give to INEC, something around 400 billion naira or something along those lines. If INEC cannot make do with that money, then how much do they need? How much is it going to take 1 trillion naira before we can run decent elections in this country? We've had 7 general elections since 1999. 99, 2003, 7, 11, 15, 19, 23. First of all, we can't even get them to hold on the day they actually say it will be held.
Yep.
This last cycle, we had election day over the course of essentially 2 months. We had the February 25th. We're supposed to have them March 11, they got postponed.
Yeah.
They went to March 18. Then we had supplementary for places where thugs came to scatter the place.
Yeah.
There was a rigging in this place.
Yeah.
Some votes were moved. So it took 2 months to hold the actual elections. The entire political cycle effectively took a year because tribunals only completed in February this year.
Yep.
So if we are going to spend 500 billion naira on elections that effectively take a year to be determined, then what the hell are we talking about? So we must come to a place where we take accountability of how we run elections internally. Elections cannot take a year. No serious country does that. The Brazilians had 2 elections actually, because they had the first round vote and they had the runoff in 2022. In 3 hours, we knew the result. Both elections, 3 hours. Tell me why in Nigeria it takes 4 days to know the results. There is no real reason. Yes, people can come up with, Nigeria is a big country, some rural communities, nonsense. We are hardly the only. The South Africans just did an election for crime. They have a large rural population actually. But we knew the result in 2 days. What is so special?
Even that was unusual.
I remember the South Africans were complaining, this is the worst election we've ever seen. They thought that was terrible.
Meanwhile, was it 2007, Morrissey was saying that America should come and learn how to do elections.
By the way, that 2007 election, the worst I've seen in Nigeria. I always say there are 3 elections that take the cake for the worst. 1959, 1983, 2007.
2003.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I agreed. 2003 is in the conversation for sure. But what was particularly bad about it? The results were being declared while people were in line to vote. That was the most absurd election.
The days of the results.
Yes, exactly. More votes than there were people in LG. That election was that's what were the wage reforms and all that. Yaradua himself knew that was terrible.
He said that pretty much in his inaugural.
Yes. Every person and their grandmother knew that was not an election. So it's amazing to me that more than nearly 20 years after, we still cannot hold the elections that are decent, and that every decent person every fair-minded person can ascertain what the result is and go home. Because this whole thing of going to the tribunal, many losers have now come to understand that it's a lifeline. If you don't win at the ballot box, you might win in court. Even when you have quite clearly not won the election, the judges can throw you a lifeline. So the electoral realm has moved to the tribunal. That's a terrible place for us to be in, because inevitably it will make the tribunals just another partisan arm. In fact, they are already there. They're already there.
You had last year you had a senator say on the floor of the Senate, thanking his wife, who was a judge, for the help she extended to some of his colleagues. And it was hilarious that his then Senate president was trying to shush him. And honorable colleague,
don't say the quiet part out loud.
This is not a good way to go. But we arrived at an interesting point in the conversation for me, because we're trying to find meaningful ways forward. Is the entire reason I'm doing this. I tell my friends who maybe they're in the oil and gas sector, financial sector, what have you, that 90% of what you guys do or should be doing is political analysis. It seems that politics, if we want to solve Nigeria's problems, is inescapable. But the question of political participation then becomes a very difficult one to have, especially for young people. I remember doing NSAS, just like my partner would tell you, even this cycle, a lot of people who participated in that protest you've seen on TV, on social media, have never, civilian rule was all they knew. They never lived under the military, they could not relate to any of it. So a lot of the heavy-handedness, the tyranny, the tear gassing, the shooting, the assassinations were extremely traumatizing. Right? And even worse with the elections, when they saw the extent that political players would go to obtain the results that they want. And me, I will always say that one of the things that shapes our expectation, I know you talked about the good governance agenda, and I think that plays a role in this as well, is that you cannot expect someone who exercise their self-interest by winning political power to then wield such power altruistically.
Absolutely.
It's so like we have these expectations of political office holder. We want them to be accountable. We want them to govern well. We want them to make policies that benefit us. We want them to respect us. But I mean, someone spent $1 billion to become senator. Bribe electoral officials, hire thugs, distribute palliative, gari, rice, bread, whatever. Just win an election. And then you want that person to be, I don't know what, John McCain on the floor of the Senate. I'm not saying John McCain is, but you have expectation of the UK Parliament, the American Congress, So it seems that politics is inescapable, but the barrier to political participation can sometimes look so high and tough, because we are, including myself, I would include myself in that, we are largely a coddled bunch, where I might have the desire to want to run for local government chairman in my local government, for example. I might go all the way to join a political party, become registered, and look at the things that have happened to some prominent people, like maybe Banky W and the like, where politicians will teach you how the game is really played. You understand? So, but I'm going to wait a little bit if, without a political godfather, I expect some form of future payback as soon as possible, to spend hundreds of millions of naira just to win that local government chairman seat, or to hire thugs to go and injure people, wound people, in some cases, kill people, just because I want to win an election. So is it a bit of an impasse? Is political participation, has it arrived at a point where it is impossible for the regular citizen?
Certainly, elections, as currently designed, exclude all but the wealthiest in our society. The APC presidential nomination form cost 100 million naira last time.
Yeah.
Most Nigerians, it's obviously, I think it's a little too bad now to say that they can't have, but that should go without saying. But many Nigerians cannot even describe what 100 million naira looks like in terms of what it can do and all of that. So that alone tells you that the political system runs on norms and ideas and practices that contradict any kind of collective impulse. Because how many people can afford to pay 100 million naira to run for president? Okay, fine. You can say the presidency is the highest. Fine. Senate races, state of assembly races, many of them cost like 2 million naira to get. How many to put it very simply, the number of Nigerians who earn 100,000 naira, you can count them.
Yeah.
There has been a number of studies done into earnings in Nigeria. It's a small number of who earn 100,000 naira. So now think of 2 million, much less 100 million. People will not spend their earnings or life savings on running for office. So there has to be a world in which people outside the extremely wealthy are able to run for office. And I think that as long as political parties remain so obscure as to be able to make up, because the political parties determine ultimately how much they charge for forms and things like that. So as long as we view political parties as alien to, I talked about how, actually I'm not sure I did, but one of the reasons why the political parties in Nigeria mirror each other, another of them I should say, is that the parties lack something in the political scientists call party system institutionalization. What does that mean? It means that the political parties don't reflect popular preference. Mm-hmm. And you see that in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Few Nigerians are signed up to any political party. They don't like them, they don't trust them, they don't trust the individuals in there, they see them as one and the same. The last presidential race we had, eligible voter turnout was 29%. If you, despite how many people registered to vote, got their PVCs, very few actually did. So part of that is because people do not like the parties, don't trust them. But the difficulty is they make the rules. They determine what happens. So until we as citizens reaccept the civic powers we have, then political parties will continue to make up the rules as they wish. And because too many of us have, and I include myself, I've said, PDP, get out, APC, LP, Accord, they're all terrible. So only a small number of people get to participate within the parties.
So my question, Chris, is I'm trying to be as practical as possible. We need to reassert ourselves, but how do we do that?
Yes.
As it is, we can't do it on the streets. They will shoot us.
That's right.
We can't do it through elections. We are not that rich. And we are not that brutal.
And they read some of them.
Yes. So what options do we have as Nigerians, to reassert ourselves? Practically.
Yes. Part of it is going back to the intermediaries I talked about. We have to, in our little spheres, beginning from our homes, our office spaces, churches, mosques, find civic and societal organizations that can amplify and elevate the voices of as many people as possible in very small units. Because you will be amazed, for instance, at how, for instance, you look at the bus stop where the bus comes and, the driver might say, or the conductor might say, oh, the fare is 400 naira, and that's not usually fair. Everybody, enough people revolt, and they say, "Oh, no one exactly, no one is getting on the bus," and they relent. That's a psychological and societal impulse to conformity. That okay, I wanted to play a fast one on people, but there was enough resistance in ways that can actually hurt me. In fact, we'll be amazed at how all it takes sometimes is enough people making a fuss about things. But you can only make a fuss when you have numbers, you see. Too often we try to make change individually. Like I always think about how, for instance, the Nigerian diaspora, particularly the UK and the US, as large as it is, toothless politically there. Contrast them, for instance, with the Ethiopian diaspora
or the
Indian diaspora. They understand one thing the Nigerian diaspora does not: organization, numbers. I think the Tigray War was the classic case study for that thing. The Ethiopian, particularly the Tigrayan diaspora in the US, played a not small part in getting sanctions on Abiy, for instance. Now, you might say the sanctions were ineffective or it was a bad idea. That's fine. But in terms of the outcomes the Tigrayan diaspora wanted, first of all, they have a large diaspora in the DC area. They put it to good use. What can the Nigerian diaspora in the UK, that is said to be 1 million, what can they put to good use? So Nigerians, unfortunately, tend to believe that individual excellence is the way to supersede many problems. Mine is not an
I think part of the problem is that I would see that of myself, certainly. I think part of it is that through our exposure and education, we've embraced this constitutional liberalism idea of individual rights.
Totally.
We think that is the ultimate expression of liberty. Whereas it may be in some sphere, but certainly where we are in terms of political development, and a lot more can be done when you express your voice in groups. Like, I mean, this is a very good insight, because this morning I was having a conversation with somebody respected older member of my family, who gave a very simple example of government changing the terms of an agreement that they had. It involves taxation. And they all revolted and said, no, this is not what we agreed, and we are not having it. And the government pulled back. So like you said, that would have been extremely difficult to achieve as an individual, which is what we usually do because of this lame-ass constitution that we have. The constitution said that I have X and Y rights, and you cannot do this. And the government will and do it anyways.
Do your worst.
Yeah. Nobody need to enforce your rights.
Exactly.
But I will disrespect them regardless. So that's a fantastic insight. But what I worry about is that how do you then deal with communities or individuals that do not really identify with, or that cannot easily be grouped? Do we not become like tyranny of the majority, so to speak?
Yes.
So because, for example, if we're talking about maybe LGBTQ rights, we know that, and that this has been an issue in many African countries. There are very small constituencies in Nigeria, even if we know that in reality there might be a lot more than that, but given the stigma and all the other complications associated with publicly identifying as such, most people are not comfortable expressing themselves that way. So are we not then at the risk of a situation where only people who have the greatest number can then assert their rights?
That is for sure a a counter-argument to the idea of collective activism, especially when you consider that having commonalities tends to be the genesis of political groupings. To that, I would say that that's where the consideration of power dynamics come into play. So I think the LGBT example is a good one. And I'm personally a skeptic of the notion of allyship and all of these things, but that, for instance, is one area where recognizing, for instance, that, as you say, LGBTQ individuals overwhelmingly do not identify in that way for obvious reasons. They don't want to be harassed or they don't want to be arrested and all of these things. It then falls to many other individuals who don't identify as LGBTQ to advance the causes that LGBTQ people advocate for, recognizing that they are less likely to be penalized socially, legally, and otherwise for doing so. It's recognizing that different struggles are interlinked. Our struggles might be different, but they exist very often in the same constellation. That is to say that the same regime that goes after, people for cyber crimes, and by cyber crimes, you mean online criticism, is often the same one cracking down on the LGBTQ people. The reasoning might be different, but the methods are almost always the same. So that's to recognize that the beginning of citizenship, civics, seeing the humanity in every one of us must start from some very basic principles, such as, are we human beings? Are we Nigerians? Are we afforded the same privileges and rights under this constitution we say we are subject to? If that is the case, we can and have to advocate for one another even when it's not always convenient. Yes, when let's say you are a Christian or a Muslim, advocating for LGBTQ rights can seem
antithetical
to what you believe.
Yeah.
But then so is human rights abuse. And so when you think ultimately about the fact, at least if you identify as a Christian or whatever, you presumably believe that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God, and no one should be abused or beaten or worse, even killed because of their sexual orientation. So at least for those of us Catholic, those of us who are Catholics, we understand the principle of condemning the act but not the person. So you see, that's why I mentioned the point about seeing the humanity in someone. You might not and perhaps don't necessarily have to agree with their sexual orientation or anything of that sort. But you definitely agree that nobody should be jailed because of who they are. And I think when many societies in Africa, because there have been African countries that have, at least decriminalized, if not quite legalized, because there are two different things. They've decriminalized, same-sex activity or, many other things in that regard, like Botswana. That's been the way the activism has gone, where even Christian groups have gotten involved and said, look, our church position it remains, but we definitely do agree that there are, for instance, reproductive rights issues involved also. There are human rights issues involved. There are child rights issues involved. We don't want people being jailed and abandoned in jail for 8 days or something because they were seen with a man was seen with another man or something along those lines. So it's looking for the humanity in one another. I do not pretend for a second that that's easy, especially in a country like ours that's so fractious, and we seemingly have so many more things that tear us apart and bring us together. But I think it falls to prominent individuals very often who have a lot of social visibility, social capital, and things of that nature to be willing to be bold, especially when the risks are minimal. And I think, again, like I was saying about how we underestimate the impetus in other people to want to go along. that's something I think we underestimate how powerful it is. Like, if someone like Elumelu were to come out and take a contravening position that seems to be go against the grain, and then some of his other millionaire and billionaire friends do the same, you will be amazed at how quickly you will see a shift in opinion, because people like to identify with those they trust, those they like, those they agree with, those they respect. So that is where the courage of people who have social advantages, to go back to the LGBTQ example, those who identify as heterosexual, to take up the mantle of LGBT rights and protect those who are LGBT in whatever way they can.
I know you're a very direct, not shy critic of technocracy.
Yes, very much so.
I am too, to a certain extent, even though I do concede that some level of technocracy is good in the context of an economy that has been badly mismanaged. So it amazes me that, for example, a respected publication like the Financial Times and so many other people can look at what is going on in Nigeria and call it reforms in any context of the world. Like, it's so disorganized, it's so incoherent, and of course, as you can see, the result is chaos. And a popular critique of the current government, which is gaining traction, even within the media, and it's the fact that the cabinet is hollow in terms of competence. There are not enough competent people who are up to scratch, who have the familiarity and the skill necessary to confront the problems.
Or even record, for that matter.
Or the record, actually, to confront the problems in their remit. Do you think there's, given that you are a critic of technocracy, do you think there's a merit to that view, that we have a competence problem?
Yes, there is, 100%. And, to the point about technocracy, my criticism of it is not that technocracy has no place in a polity, or that it's necessarily bad. My difficulty with technocracy, as it's proffered by those who believe in it, is that it's an alternative to what they define as politics. And politics is usually defined in some very narrow, one-dimensional ways that I don't think lends itself to diagnosing what the problem actually is. For instance, people will say to you, "Oh, we need more technocrats in the government." And who do they have in mind? A banker. And I'm thinking to myself, what demonstrable technical ability other than running a bank does a banker have? Or they will say, "Oh, somebody from the World Bank." And I'm thinking, what
demonstrable somebody from the private sector.
Exactly. What if the idea is competence? What have these people actually run? Since you say technocracy is the solution, what technical ability do they actually have in the way that lends itself to their competence in that area? And more to the point, what is technocracy what is it meant to resolve? Like, what alternative is it presenting itself as? And you'll get some people say, we just need people to focus on governance. We spend too much time doing politics. And I think to myself, well, governance is politics. Governance is a part of politics. Governance requires policymakers to make choices about how to allocate finite resources that people disagree over how, where, when to allocate them. That process is quite literally the definition of politics. So it seems to me that people view politics as synonymous with partisanship. And that's where the problem lies. Governance is about marshalling the resources, organizational capacity, the capabilities of the state to make choices about that allocation. That is a political process. Nothing more could be political than that. So if the idea is to, as people often say, put politics aside, then what are we doing? Politics can't be put aside for the simple reason that politics, in the corporate sense of it, is different entities across society with radically different views on a range of issues coming together to compete. So how can politics not be a part of that process? So it seems to me that the problem isn't necessarily about politicians versus technocrats. It is one of, very often, the lack of an agenda. Very often we have governments that come into power with little clue of what they want to do. We are seeing it quite literally right now with a government that, as you say, is so incoherent across the board that when I read that article you referred to about shock therapy, and I thought to myself, this government with the expansionary fiscal policy is what you call shock therapy. Do words not mean anything anymore? What the hell are you talking about? The current administration is many things, but shock therapy is not one of them to my mind. And believe me, I am the foremost critic of shock therapy, so I know it when I see it. That's not what I say. This government is spending its way to oblivion.
Yeah, like a drunken sailor.
It had 2 budgets this year. What are you talking about? But what I see is a government that has no agenda, that is gasping at straws. The only thing it wakes up to do is, oh, we have to just do something and make people quiet and, do the barest minimum. Like you have people congratulate, current government, state and federal. They are passing the budget on time. And thinking about that, that's become an objective. You've got to be kidding me. The bar has got to be raised. If that is the issue under which the politics versus technocracy debate falls under, then I'm not sure we have the right problem diagnosed. Or even the fact that you pick up a number of individuals who I won't mention any names, but some folks have identified as the technocrats in this government. What have they accomplished?
Oh, yeah.
What are they actually doing in government? In any case, technocrats have political objectives. They answer to somebody. Yep. They have a boss. That's politics. That's politics. They have outcomes that they want to get to, that people are trying to obstruct. That's politics. So we have to understand the meaning of words when we use them. There is no... Fundamentally, I understand that many, especially the white-collar professionals, what they really object to is the fractious give-and-go nature of deliberative democracy. That, people feel like, oh, politicians spend too much time, patronage, this, that, that's politics. There is not a single country on earth that does not have any of the elements that they identify with politics. Is it that patronage politics exists everywhere? Okay. There's a reason why, for instance, in the US, bundlers get ambassadorships. That's patronage right there. That nothing more could count as patronage. Whether it is making decisions with an eye on the electoral clock. When Bush asked the Saudis to pump more oil in 2004, that's politics. So it seems to me that people don't actually know what they're against. Mm-hmm. They have a caricature of the way they think government should function versus the way government actually does function. So I think people need to reconcile what they believe they know and what actually is. That way we can diagnose what the real problem is, which is that there are too many people in government who don't know what the hell they are doing, whether they are technocrats or politicians. They do not know why they are in government, other than I had a godfather, he put my name on the list, and I'm representing his or her interests.
One of the, I don't know if that's the right word, incredible things that I think the Buhari government achieved solidly is the fact that the heavens will not fall if Nigeria is irrelevant in the world.
Yes, it's one of my...
Because, I know that's your area of expertise and where you work currently, and that's what I'm bringing to you. Nigeria is irrelevant
completely
in international affairs as it is.
We have never been more irrelevant, in fact.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, we are now living in a time where the geopolitical space or the geopolitical reality is more tensed, more fractured than ever. You talk of multipolarity in the world, you talk of the return of mercantilism in international trade, and so many other things that requires leverage, interests, alliances, and mutuality in strategy. Like it's just like we are there and the world is just whizzing by around us. So let me ask you, like, if maybe a politician or a policymaker's question, how do we make Nigeria relevant again? Because, like you said, when you talk about sanctions, these are not things without its implications on Nigerians who are traveling, doing business all over the world, whether they are in the diaspora or home. Or these things have real world consequences. Look at the situation with Niger. We made a fool of ourselves. Right? We bluffed ourselves into possibly one of the most laughable sanctions regime in history. So, how do we get our mojo back internationally?
It starts from the home front. International foreign policy.
I just went to the Olympics.
Yeah, no medals.
Largest no medals.
Not even a one.
But I mean, we seem to have this collective belief. Even from the average man on the street, that we matter. I don't know if it's the population or even the oil thing. We are not the largest oil producer in Africa anymore. We are the fourth largest economy now. And I know we are going to rebase ourselves back to the top. Exactly. Very soon. So, but I mean, go on, please. How?
I always say that people, both elites and the public, are stuck in the 1970s in terms of foreign affairs. People still look at Nigeria as that country that we stood up for South Africa.
Yeah, and we ensure that they never forget.
Exactly.
Well, part of every little thing.
Exactly. There are two things Nigerians always bring up about our foreign policy: South Africa and West Africa. Exactly. I didn't even have to say it. Exactly. ECOMOG, we went there and we stabilized Liberia, we stabilized Sierra Leone, Gambia, all these places. That was 30 years ago, roughly. It was 30 years ago in South Africa, more than in fact. We gave South Africans passports to come to Nigeria. Thabo Mbeki was living in Lagos. That's 1978. That's 46 years ago. Are you going to tell the story of today using a frame of reference from 46 years ago? The fact that you are doing that tells me everything. That you don't have a frame of reference from today is why you are going to be passed. Yeah, so too many Nigerians, I remember at a conference earlier this year in Abuja, I said so that Nigerians do not recognize just how weakened and irrelevant internationally their country is, and one person strenuously argued against it. What am I talking about? Nigeria is this and that, and the other thing, and I simply pointed out the point you made about Niger. Niger, literally next door to us. We were not able to compel them to do anything they did not want to do. This is a country that, if you want to talk about leverage, we have a ton of it theoretically over them, but yet we could not exercise any kind of influence there. We can't exercise influence in Benin, next door to us to our west. This is a country where Nigerian trucks get harassed by their customs agents. And this is something the governor of Lagos State should be able to even resolve on his own. He shouldn't need the foreign affairs minister to do that. Such is the heft of it's this country some people jokingly call it the 37th state. Nigeria has zero influence there. Nigeria has zero influence in Cameroon, zero influence in Chad, zero influence in West Africa. Look at what the juntas in Mali, Niger, and Burkina are doing. We have zero influence, and that is because our political elite, including the president himself, think of these issues through the prism of the 20th century. Where Nigeria, they talk about Tafawa Balewa's manifest destiny idea and all that. Tafawa Balewa is dead. Manifest destiny. What manifest destiny? In 2024, where Nigeria is the poverty capital of the world, what the hell are you talking about? In a world where French and US bases are all over West Africa, in a region where China is the largest economic partner, the hell are you talking about? People are not recognizing the world that exists, where Nigeria, even if it wanted to, could not project any means of influence, because there are far more significant players that exist in our own backyard. By the way, I just talked about some of them. So how we can get some of that back is simply by going to the basics of having a competent state, first of all. Because we do not have a strategy for foreign relations with the world. We don't. We don't have with our neighbors in West Africa. We don't have for the continent. We certainly do not have for the globe. Yes, our foreign minister and president go to UNGA, they will go to FOCAC, they go to G20, they go to, but they attend those things. They don't participate in them. There's a difference. They go to those things, but they are not at the seat of decision making. They are on the menu. Our leaders seem to take pride in being present for these things. They don't seem to, for instance, the fact that we took 3,000 odd people to COP28, that told me everything I needed to know. No serious-minded country will ever let such a thing happen. The fact that...
I'll give you my personal example.
Yes.
Like on this point. The Deputy Treasury Secretary came to Nigeria.
Absolutely.
And
a Nigerian American.
Yes, a Nigerian American. That's important. It's important to stress. And did not meet a single cabinet minister, a single member of the cabinet. Like, visited a bunch of private businesses, went to a business school to give a
speech, stock exchange or something.
And like it was just like right? The Deputy Treasury Secretary of the biggest economy in the world.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, we go to these things, like you said, and we've even introduced this idea of ridiculous mushroom investment summits that
don't get me started.
Have no significance whatsoever. Just put together by some random people in their palace. Like we took our president to India like a few months after there was no single member of the India cabinet or representative of the Indian government in that particular event. It was not, the Indian government had no role in that particular, but we took our own president, head of state there.
So we're in August, right? Good. UNGA is next month. Everything we just talked about, you see in real time. That week of UNGA, where the new assembly starts. The president will be put on, and his ministers, all sorts of panel events, side events, because that's actually the not a vote of UNGA. It's not actually the speeches, it's actually the side events. That's like 90% of what they do. Most of them are boring, by the way. The president will be sent to a range of things of very dubious relevance. And no one will dare to ask one very important question. To what end is the head of state of Africa's largest economy participating in this? Nobody will ask that question. We seem to, especially for a country that talks about that leadership mantle, because our leaders constantly go on about it in domestic and foreign forums about how we are the leader of Africa, what we've done, but the burden of leadership, we don't exercise it in any way. We want to exercise the privileges of being thought of as the leader, but the kind of heavy, meaningful questions, thoughts, actions, we don't want to. So the president will be sent on one panel with I remember there was I think it was a conference somewhere in the Middle East. I don't quite know. I think it might have been Saudi Arabia, or perhaps it was Qatar. In any case, you had President Bola Tinubu and Paul Kagame on a panel discussion with nobodies. And I thought to myself, here is the president of Nigeria,
one of the longest serving head of state
in the world, frankly speaking, schmoozing with nobodies about God knows what.
So, I mean, on that point, so maybe you can just give me a broad answer to that, because I think it's a point that is extensible to Africa, at least.
Very much so.
Because we see, so like my friend he always say, which is that Africa needs to stop being the place where history happens to.
Agreed.
History, everything just happens to us.
Bystanders.
We don't do it. If we don't make history, we don't do it. It just happens to us. We need to stop, because, like what you just said, these ridiculous things that passes for vibes in Africa. How do we really get our self-respect? Like a washed up career dead rapper like Jaru will come to Ghana and say they are doing some empowerment bullshit, building schools. Idris Elba is
doing the film school or acting school or whatever he's saying.
In Africa, I have nothing against the guy. I don't particularly care for his films, but whatever. Like, Africa, Day of Return.
Yeah, the Day of Return. Yeah. Oh, I went to those events. I saw the American celebrities.
What's his name? This dream chaser boy.
Oh, McMill.
McMill is the Ghanaian president. McMill.
Chance the rapper met with the president in sneakers and jeans.
Like, you can't even do rap royalty like Jay-Z or now.
In Jubilee building.
How did we get into this ridiculous mess, and why don't our leaders have self-respect?
Believe me.
You hear of a Germany Africa summit. It's never a Germany Nigeria bilateral. It's always Africa.
Russia Africa, India Africa, Korea Africa, Italy Africa.
Germany Africa summit where the entire kitty is 45 million euros. So how, I put it to you again, how do we get out of this Bambiala foreign policy?
It's absurd. Countries like Nigeria have got to take on that leadership role. It has to start by simply not attending some of these things. There has got to come a point where the Nigerian president and foreign minister look at an invitation and send at best a minister. The head of states of Nigeria and other African countries cannot and should not be turning up to Italy Africa Summit. What the hell is Italy? What relevance is Italy to Africa's future outside of the framework of migration? Because that's what that's all about. Italy's preoccupation is migration. Fine, that's Italy's problem. That's not Africa's problem. It's one thing for US Africa Leaders Summit. The US is a superpower. The US dollar is the reserve currency. The US has the largest network of alliances. It has veto powers in international institutions like the WHO, the World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, and all of that. It's one thing for FOCAC, Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Fine, China is basically the world factory. I understand those two. That's the reality of geopolitics. But tell me why 45 heads of state are showing up to the Russia-Africa Summit as happened in 2019.
Yeah, and Putin was shushing them.
Russia-Africa trade is less than $20 billion. Mm-hmm. Less than 20 billion. But somehow, prominent heads of state of this continent think it is in their interest to attend such things. They don't even understand the nature of the global environment. Now, personally, I can be convinced as to why, and I do believe that broadening your partnerships makes sense, but Russia is in many ways a pariah state. So you are investing all of your time and diplomatic capital on behalf of a partnership with a country that is, a pariah. So you are investing as much effort into dealing with Russia as you are with China. There is no sense of scale involved. There is no sense of, understanding trade-offs, opportunity costs. This is how statesmen and women should think about these issues. So part of it must simply start with, we are not attending Korea-Africa summit. Not when what is at stake is $300 million to be shared among 55 countries. You're joking. That's absurd. So there must come a place of pride where heads of state take some pride in who they and their countries are and say, no, I think we'll send a minister for this, or perhaps even an ambassador or somebody of that nature. That the head of state cannot be put through, next year they will do the EU-Africa summit. I remember the last one they did in Brussels, where they ushered the African leaders through some door at the back. Of course, they came up with some reason why, some technical reason. We have different doors for different. Image is everything. Image is everything. The fact that, first of all, you are being called abroad, all of you, and you actually go, that tells you who's in control of that relationship. You might not, you can argue all the points you want to, but people have eyes. People have a brain. They can see who's in control. The fact that randoms can usher no fewer than 20 African heads of state, and they will show up. That tells you everything about where we are. So it must start with countries like Nigeria. To be fair to South Africa, I must say, Ramaphosa and other South African presidents exercise judgment. They don't always go to all of these things.
Well, you led the Russia-Africa thing.
Yes. Now, that's because Russia and South Africa have a history that goes back both to the Soviet Union, but even in the post-Cold War era, Russia and South Africa are strategic partners. They have a 2013 strategic partnership. Russia invests in South Africa. Exactly. So there is a structural relationship there in ways that don't exist for Nigeria. So I don't see why, for example, a Nigerian president should be going to Russia-Africa summit, not when, the bilateral relationship is minimal and, pro-Russia sentiment is scarce and there is no real reason for Nigeria to invest that kind of effort in that kind of relationship. So we have to, Africa, as you say, Africa must come to a place where its political leaders and people stop seeing, as you say, Babiala. We cannot be, in this world where we expect charity from other actors. There is no charity anywhere. This one will say loan, we take. Russia, take it. Brazil, China, World Bank, we take it. Fine, loans, the reality of, economics are that debt is necessarily a part of public policy, but what are we using those loans for? When we take these loans, are they going to projects that will actually benefit the Nigerian people, that the Nigerian people actually are consulted in terms of how those projects are actually created from the ground up, or does it go to friends of the ruling party? These are the ways we must think about the connectivities between the domestic and the foreign, because whether we like it or not, the weak Nigerian state has ramifications abroad. If you don't believe me, get arrested in a foreign embassy, foreign airport. When an American gets arrested abroad, best believe the US embassy in that country is getting involved. Try as a Nigerian national to be arrested in a foreign country. So if you don't think that there is a connection between what we do at home and what happens abroad, you are sorely mistaken. It matters very much. Nigeria is viewed as a pariah in many ways too. There is no way, even countries in Africa that are much poorer than us, harass our citizens, our nationals. I have personally experienced it several times over on this continent and elsewhere. The minute people see that you are in Nigeria, they see your name or your passport or anything, you get the worst kind of treatment, and there is no recourse anywhere. The Nigerian state will abandon you very often. We must take the position that Nigerian citizens should not be left to their own devices, especially when Nigerians in the diaspora do very well. This same government claims them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Write letters of congratulations. Governors be sowing threats on Twitter. I remember in 2020, there was some Nigerian doctor in the US, I believe it was, who did something excellent. I can't remember what now. And Ibeazu wrote an 8-part thread about how, his government, this and that, because the person was from Abia, and talked about how this reflects well on the state of Abia and this and that. Or when Kayode Fayemi said himself, actually, he said that, he called the parents of a young lawmaker, a state lawmaker in Minnesota, who apparently was from Ekiti, and he called the parents to congratulate her and all of these things. And first of all, we must stop that nonsense. That's actually something I want to address. That we have this thing where, particularly our either nationals or people of Nigerian heritage, especially the US and UK, when they excel, we get so obsequious about it. I remember getting into a thing on Twitter when Peter Obi congratulated a Nigerian American brigadier general, a man running for the office of president of Nigeria, congratulating a general officer of a foreign army. Think about that.
Yeah.
Someone who wants to be the head of state of the largest country in Africa, congratulating a general officer of a foreign nation. And I remember talking about how the optics about and the substance of that looked so terrible, and his supporters predictably defended him. But that speaks to what I'm saying, that we have people in office or political prominence who do not understand why pride matters in international affairs. That the way you carry yourself is the way people will treat you. That a man who wants to be president of Nigeria should not be congratulating a foreign officer for anything. Why is he doing that? How does it reflect positively on Nigeria in any way that this woman happened to have parents who were at some point Nigerians? Of what benefit is that to Nigeria or Nigerians? But we have people who don't understand these ideas. So they think, I also saw, I believe it was last week or perhaps the week before, the former Senate president's wife congratulating, I believe, her nephew who runs for the United Kingdom, and she was cheering him on. And she didn't seem to see the problem with that, the wife of the former Senate president cheering on a foreign national. We have too many people who have little understanding of where they are placed in international politics, and I think it reflects on us as Nigerians. We don't understand this game of international politics. We think it's just about UNGA, G20, having a passport and all of it. No. If you want to be taken seriously especially when you come from this part of the world, you have to show up as serious. You can't be indulging in many of the frivolities we do. Like, for instance, saying that a country that barred your citizens from coming there has lifted the ban only for it to be a lie.
Or linking to the private website.
Exactly. Exactly. These are presidential aides who do these things. These are firing offenses. But we have people who do not understand the importance of any of this. They think it's just like working in a ministry or something. So that sense of pride, of knowing your place in the world, of understanding that if you want to be taken seriously, you have to present as serious. That's where it all starts from. Because you can design all the policies, this, that, but if you do not even see yourself as a stakeholder in the international system, none of it matters.
One, not unique to me, but criticism I have of socialism is that I have never seen a socialist theory of change. Socialism is usually good at criticizing capitalism or the status quo or whatever, but we know that, of course, even historically up to now, some actually existing avowed socialist countries are terrible. Venezuela, Cuba, to name just two. But you personally, Chris, as a socialist, what is your theory of change apart from the things that you critique, the over reliance on the market system, your liberalism, and all of that? Because I could tell you as a Chauvinitarian capitalist that innovation eventually drives change. I'm an innovation capitalist. What is your own theory of change? What is your alternative of organizing society for progress?
Yes. I would say, before I answer that, I would say that socialism, and certainly not I'm not opposed to innovation either. Innovation, first of all, goes without saying, whether or not I like it, it's going to happen. Simply because human nature needs to progress. So I would say that innovation is independent, well, not independent, but it's sort of orthogonal to my preference as to how it should, society should move along. What I would say is that the way the innovation takes place is what I have views on. So that just to address that.
Yeah.
As for my theory of change would be that ownership, entrepreneurship, economic participation more broadly is social, in the sense that I do not believe that, and prefer to see that, I do not believe that such economic activity should be constrained or restricted to firms, for instance, because when you think of a lot of, especially laissez-faire capitalism, because there are very different strands of capitalism. Yeah. Laissez-faire capitalism believes that the state should have close to no, or to the extent that it's possible anyway, involvement in economic exchanges and activity, and it should
just only regulate.
Yes, and some, in fact, the more Austrian school don't even believe that the state should regulate.
Yeah, those ones are great.
Exactly. But yes, broadly speaking, they think the state should only regulate, and that firms, groupings of independent, autonomous organisms, known as firms, should be the mode of exchange. I think that there are so many reasons why, and we've talked about some of them, why that works better in theory than it does in practice, and it excludes so many participants who don't have the means of organizing in that way. It makes certain social goods and services rivalrous that don't need to be rivalrous. So, however, when social goods and services are socialized, it minimizes the risk that people can be excluded from things they should not be excluded from. It doesn't preclude the possibility for innovation, for instance. It doesn't, for example, a tech company that is socially owned or socially run by, let's say, its employees or whatever, does not necessarily need to avoid innovation. But what it knows is that some individuals cannot take the firm's profits, risk it, and want to privatize the gains, but socialize the losses. What we have in the neoliberal capitalist system is exactly that, where firms, under the aegis of risk-taking, innovation, do all sorts of things. They fail, they turn to taxpayers. Please help us, we are too big to fail. That's where my theory of change is that risk should be socialized broadly, as should reward. Because when, there is an asymmetry of power in market economics, in that those who are most able to leverage it for their end get to reap all of the benefits and can externalize all of the risks in ways that are deeply unfair. So my theory of change would be that some levers need to be put in place to even out the scores.
Thank you very much, Chris. There's no need to even say it's always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes.